The Pacific. Late afternoon, 1944. A steel horizon blurs into storm-gray sky. The USS Iowa cuts through the swells. A moving fortress, 45,000 tons of steel humming under the weight of war. Inside her fire control center, men watch the radar scopes in silence. Sweat, oil, and the slow ticking of the gyro compass fill the air. Then comes the order. Turrets 1, 2, and 3 lock toward the horizon. The barrels, each longer than a city bus, tilt up, searching for a target 20 miles away. The deck trembles. Every man aboard holds his breath. The gunnery officer whispers the last command. Fire! A thunderclap tears the ocean apart. 6 shells, each weighing nearly a ton, leap from the barrels at twice the speed of sound. The shockwave slams across the sea like a living wall. Somewhere beyond the horizon, steel and earth vanish in an instant. No planes, no bombs. Just 6 shells, and the Pacific itself seemed to pause. The USS Iowa was born from a moment of fear and pride. By the late 1930s, the world's oceans were turning into test grounds for ideology and steel. Japan had launched the Yamato, a floating mountain of armor with guns so large that no Western navy had ever matched them. Across the Pacific, American admirals took the challenge personally. If Japan was building giants, the United States would build something faster and just as lethal. The Iowa class was the answer. Sleek where the Yamato was ponderous, she was designed not only to fight, but to arrive. A fast battleship capable of escorting carriers and outrunning threats. Her triple 16-inch, 50-caliber Mark 7 guns could throw a 2,700-pound shell over 23 miles. Her engines pushed her to 33 knots, a speed unheard of for a ship her size. She was not simply armor and firepower, she was engineering audacity turned into metal. When USS Iowa was commissioned in February 1943, she represented the peak of American naval design, and, unknowingly, the twilight of an era. By then, carriers like Enterprise and Yorktown had already rewritten the rules of sea combat. Air power ruled. Battleships had been humbled at Pearl Harbor. Yet the Navy's planners refused to believe that the age of guns was over. Guns were tangible, visible proof of power. In the minds of those who built her, Iowa was America's steel reply to every nation that still believed supremacy came from caliber and armor. Her first missions were diplomatic, not destructive. She carried President Franklin D. Roosevelt across the Atlantic in 1943 for the Tehran Conference, a symbol of trust in her speed and safety. But by 1944, the war had moved west. The Pacific was a battleground of islands, airstrips, and steel hulls. Japan's empire stretched thin, and the United States was now advancing, island by island, base by base, toward the Japanese homeland. In this new phase of the war, Iowa and her sisters, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin, were called forward. Their task was simple but brutal: bombard, neutralize, annihilate. No longer were battleships the centerpiece of fleet duels. Now they were the executioners of coastal defenses, the hammer that cleared the way for the Marines and airfields that followed. For the men aboard, it was a strange kind of duty. They knew they were sailing on the most powerful battleship ever built, yet their glory came from firing at shorelines most would never see. They loaded shells the size of cars, adjusted gun elevation by fractions of degrees, and trusted that somewhere beyond the haze, those calculations would decide the fate of hundreds. Each firing drill was a ritual, the crew operating like clockwork inside heat and noise that could crush the senses. When the guns roared, the shock could split eardrums and rattle bones, and yet every man felt it. Pride. The kind of pride that came from knowing they were part of something unstoppable. But in the upper echelons of command, debates raged. Admirals like Nimitz and Spruance were turning increasingly to carriers. Battleships like Iowa still offered unmatched bombardment potential, but their days of ship-to-ship duels were gone. The new ocean battlefield belonged to pilots and radar screens, not gunners and plotting rooms. Still, fate would grant Iowa one more chance to prove that the thunder of her guns could still rule the sea. Her moment would come in 1944, when a Japanese stronghold bristling with artillery and pride challenged the U.S. advance. And in that moment, with no planes, no bombs, and just 6 shells, the battleship would remind the world why she had been built. By 1944, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield of equals. After years of brutal fighting, Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Japan's once proud fleet was battered and scattered. The Imperial Navy still possessed courage and experience, but the tide of industry had turned. The United States was now building warships, planes, and ammunition faster than Japan could count. Every month, new carriers slid down American shipyards, and entire task forces assembled to push westward. The war had shifted into a new phase, a relentless advance through the Central Pacific. Island by island, the U.S. Navy was drawing a straight line toward Tokyo. The Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines. Each step forward demanded not just bravery, but firepower. Massive firepower. Before Marines could storm a beach, every enemy gun, bunker, and airstrip had to be pulverized. That was where the Iowa came in. Carriers could bomb from afar, but their strikes were brief, measured in minutes, not hours. The Iowa could stay. She could pound a shoreline all day, reshaping entire landscapes. Her 16-inch guns could penetrate concrete, crater airfields, and erase fortifications in single salvos. When aircraft missed, Iowa did not. She fired until there was nothing left to fire at. In the summer of 1944, as the U.S. prepared to assault the Marianas, the chain of islands that included Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, Iowa joined Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher. This was the most powerful fleet ever assembled. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 18 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a brutal mix of sea, air, and steel that would break Japan's carrier arm for good. But behind that massive air campaign, the Iowa and her sisters played a quieter, deadlier role. They softened the islands for invasion. From the horizon, the Iowa's gunfire looked like distant lightning. Each salvo threw tons of metal skyward. The shells screamed across the sea before disappearing into explosions that rolled like thunder. Pilots flying overhead described the sight as watching mountains being moved. Japanese soldiers called it Jigoku no Ame, hell's rain. For the imperial garrisons, there was no answer. Anti-aircraft guns could shoot at planes, but nothing could stop a 16-inch shell. Entire trenches vanished under the blasts. Bunkers that had taken months to build were erased in seconds. Even veteran officers began to understand. Air raids were terrifying, but the battleship's guns were final. Yet, even as Iowa unleashed her power, the irony was growing clearer. The war she had been built for, ship-to-ship duels across open seas, no longer existed. Carrier planes now hunted from hundreds of miles away. The enemy fleet rarely came within visual range. For months, Iowa fired her guns not at ships, but at land. Still, her reputation spread. Radio Tokyo called her the demon ship. To the Americans who saw her at work, she was something else entirely. A reminder of the industrial muscle behind every advance. When Iowa fired, It wasn't just a bombardment. It was a message. The Pacific belonged to the United States now, and no fortress could withstand its reach. By late 1944, as U.S. forces approached Leyte Gulf and the Philippines, Iowa was no longer just a battleship. She was an icon. Her silhouette meant safety to the Marines ashore and doom to anyone under her guns. And soon, in one unforgettable moment, 6 of those guns would roar in unison, not as part of an air raid, nor a bombardment run, but as a single, precise strike that would echo across the Pacific. The day the Iowa's guns ruled the ocean was approaching. Every weapon, no matter how powerful, is still a sum of the humans behind it. For all her scale and steel, USS Iowa was alive only because 2,700 men kept her breathing. Engineers, gunners, electricians, cooks, radar operators, and young sailors who had never seen the ocean before the war. Inside her hull, life was a rhythm of heat, vibration, and constant noise. The ship never stopped moving. Steam turbines howled through bulkheads. Pumps and gears drummed underfoot. The crew slept in tight rows, woke to alarms, and lived under red battle lights that turned their faces the color of rust. They ate meals by schedule, worked by whistle, and trusted the ship more than they trusted luck. But in one part of the ship, precision mattered more than anywhere else: the gun turrets. Each turret was a fortress of its own, 3 stories tall, weighing more than a destroyer. Inside, dozens of men worked like machinery themselves. Powdermen stacked silk bags of propellant. Loaders hoisted 2,700-pound shells into rammers. Elevation operators adjusted the barrels degree by degree, while fire control teams deep inside the ship fed in range data from radar and optical directors above deck. The process of firing a single salvo required over 100 synchronized movements. It was ballet by stopwatch. Except one mistake could kill everyone inside. The Mark 7 guns were monsters of mechanical beauty. Each barrel was 66 feet long, capable of launching a shell over 40 kilometers with enough kinetic energy to flatten a city block. At maximum range, a shell took almost 90 seconds to reach its target. 90 seconds where men on both sides held their breath. The blast from a full 9-gun salvo could lift the sea itself, flatten small boats, and knock birds from the sky. Sailors joked that when Iowa fired, the Pacific blinked. But there was something more than firepower at play. There was pride. The gunnery crews called their guns Thunder 1, Thunder 2, and Thunder 3. They polished the breeches, kept score of hits, and swore by the accuracy of their fire control systems, a marvel of analog engineering that could track targets beyond the horizon using mechanical computers the size of desks. These electromechanical brains, called the Mark 8 rangekeepers, calculated range, bearing, wind, ship motion, and even the Earth's rotation. Long before digital computing, the Iowa could deliver pinpoint strikes at distances once thought impossible. Each shot was an equation, each detonation a conclusion. For the men in the plotting room, the sound of the guns above wasn't thunder. It was music. It meant every calculation was correct. Every life at stake on a beach somewhere might now be spared because the target had been erased. For them, accuracy was mercy. Yet, not everyone aboard shared the same calm detachment. On deck, sailors could feel the power. The shock of the blast rattled lungs and teeth. Even with ear protection, the pressure was overwhelming. When the guns fired, the ship itself recoiled several feet in the water. For a moment, it felt as though the entire Pacific was pushing back. To new recruits, it was awe. To veterans, it was responsibility. The Iowa wasn't just another battleship. She was the pride of an industrial nation that had mastered mass production and precision in equal measure. Everything about her, from the radar to the rivets, represented the United States' transformation from a peacetime democracy to an unstoppable war machine. Even the Japanese understood that. Their intelligence reports called the Iowa class unsinkable by conventional means. Japanese officers briefed their gunners to avoid wasting ammunition against her armor belt. It was simply too thick. She was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. And yet, beneath that invincibility, the men aboard knew the truth. No ship is truly unsinkable. The Pacific was littered with ghosts. Ships thought indestructible, now rusting graves beneath the waves. Every time Iowa entered battle, her crew went through the same rituals. Last letters written, medals polished, helmets checked, prayers whispered. The thunder above deck was always balanced by silence below. For all her might, the Iowa was a paradox, a relic built for duels that no longer happened, yet indispensable in the new age of total war. Her guns represented both the pinnacle of human engineering and the beginning of its obsolescence. Still, when the call came to fire, to unleash those 6 shells that would make history, none of that mattered. In that moment, it wasn't about strategy or technology. It was about the men who loaded, aimed, and fired with everything they had. The ocean would soon remember their work. The Pacific War was often described as a chessboard of islands. Each one, from tiny coral atolls to volcanic ridges, held airstrips, guns, and men who would die defending them. But what made USS Iowa so terrifying was not that she fought these battles, it was how she ended them. In a time when air raids dominated headlines, the battleship's gunnery strikes were old-fashioned, almost primitive. Yet, in practice, they were among the most psychologically devastating operations of the war. The sound of an Iowa-class broadside carried for miles, a slow, building thunder that rolled across the sea long before the shells landed. Japanese observers often described it as the voice of a god. Those who survived bombardments said the ground itself seemed to move, as if the island were trying to shake them off. But there was nothing divine about it. It was math, metal, and pressure. Pure physics weaponized. Each 16-inch shell exploded with the force of several tons of TNT. When 6 were fired together, the shock waves created overlapping concussions that shattered eardrums, collapsed tunnels, and left survivors disoriented for hours. Japanese engineers later noted that even deeply buried bunkers were often rendered useless after repeated bombardments. Concrete fractured invisibly, air vents collapsed, electrical systems failed. The target might look intact from the air, until someone tried to fire from it and found their weapon buried in rubble. This was the tactical brilliance of the Iowa. Precision saturation. She didn't need to carpet an island. She could erase its critical points with a handful of shots. Her radar-directed fire control allowed her to hit a target 20 miles away. Unseen, unreachable, yet completely vulnerable. It was modern war distilled to its coldest truth. Whoever struck first, and most accurately, controlled the field. For the Americans, it meant control without exposure. For the Japanese, it meant terror without warning. At Saipan, Tinian, and later at the Philippines, garrison commanders learned to recognize the pattern. The eerie calm before bombardment. A single spotting shell landing harmlessly offshore. And then, seconds later, the storm. The men called it Rokudan Mei, the 6 names of death. They counted the shells as they fell, and if they reached 6, they assumed nothing on that grid square survived. Even American pilots felt awe watching it unfold. From altitude, they could see the trajectories, glowing arcs of steel leaving the horizon, descending in slow motion before vanishing into pillars of smoke. One naval aviator wrote in his journal, "It was like watching the earth speak back to the sky." But Iowa's role wasn't only about destruction. Strategically, her presence reshaped how the U.S. Navy approached amphibious assaults. Before 1944, naval bombardments were largely guesswork, a storm of shells hoping to hit something important. Iowa changed that. With advanced radar rangefinders, spotting aircraft, and aerial reconnaissance data, she could coordinate with Marine units to walk fire inland, a technique later perfected in Korea and Vietnam. Every salvo moved forward like a steel tide, clearing zones yard by yard. Admiral Raymond Spruance once remarked, "If Iowa fires, the argument is over." Her accuracy wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The enemy didn't just lose positions, they lost willpower. Intercepted Japanese radio transmissions often reported total communication loss or panic after an Iowa-class bombardment. One captured officer admitted, "We stopped returning fire because we no longer knew where we were." That's what 6 shells could do. Not just destroy, but disorient. To the Americans, that precision was proof of progress. To the Japanese, it was proof of inevitability. Still, within the Navy itself, some officers saw the irony. Iowa's dominance at bombardment only underscored how few worthy naval targets remained. Carrier aviation had already destroyed most of Japan's surface fleet. The guns were being used to crush fortresses, not ships. She was the most advanced battleship in history, fighting enemies that no longer came to sea. But on the tactical map, her relevance remained undeniable. At every major island invasion, from Saipan to Okinawa, the arrival of Iowa meant the beginning of the end. She was both the first and last word of the operation, and so in 1944, when a fortified Japanese position deep in the Pacific refused to surrender, even under air attack, command turned to the Iowa. 6 shells. That was all it would take. The old warship was about to prove, one last time, that steel and precision could still change the course of history. It was November 1944. The USS Iowa steamed through the Philippine Sea as part of Task Group 38.2, the spearhead of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. The Leyte Gulf campaign was raging, and the Japanese Empire was fighting for its life. Air raids had crippled Japan's carriers, but along the coasts of the Philippines, artillery and hidden coastal batteries still threatened the landings. American transports and destroyers had come under sporadic fire from positions that refused to die. One of those positions lay near Ormoc Bay, on the western shore of Leyte. A network of concrete bunkers, camouflaged gun pits, and supply caves carved into the cliffs was holding back U.S. advances. Repeated air attacks had done little. The targets were too well hidden, and the terrain too jagged for low-level strikes. Every attempt to silence them cost pilots and time. That was when the order came. Send in the Iowa. The great ship approached under gray skies, waves breaking against her bow. Inside the Combat Information Center, radar plotted the shoreline. Observers from carrier aircraft transmitted coordinates, triangulated to within 100 yards. Iowa's gunnery officer, Commander William Evans, stood over the plotting table and studied the numbers. 6 guns, 1 target. It didn't need to be complicated. Turrets. 1 and 2 turned slowly to port. The ship's entire hull groaned under the motion. Deep inside, loaders worked in silence. The same ritual repeated 1,000 times. Powder bags stacked, shells hoisted, breech locked. Each shell bore a name: Iowa Thunder, Dixie. Remember Pearl. Tiny chalk words on 2,700 pounds of steel. On the bridge, Captain John McCrea gave a simple nod. Commence firing. The first salvo shattered the silence. The key. Concussion rolled through the sea like a physical force, slamming into nearby escorting ships. 6 shells, a combined weight of over 16,000 pounds, rose into the overcast sky, vanishing beyond the horizon in less than 10 seconds. Then came the wait. 90 seconds of silence. Men counted under their breath. Even the engines seemed to quiet. Then the horizon flashed. The shells struck the cliffs of Ormoc Bay almost simultaneously. The first round hit a suspected battery position, vaporizing it. The second penetrated a concrete bunker and detonated within. The next 4 walked across the ridge, each explosion sending debris hundreds of feet into the air. A plume of dust and fire rose so high it merged with the clouds. Observers in aircraft reported complete destruction of target area. When the smoke cleared, the cliffside itself had partially collapsed into the sea. 6 shells. 1 minute of fire, and a position that had resisted for weeks. Gone. On deck, sailors cheered quietly. Not in triumph, but in awe. The gunnery crew watched as radar confirmed what their eyes already knew. The echoes had vanished. The Japanese guns that had harassed the beachhead were silent. In the command room, Macrae simply said, "Cease fire." He didn't need to add anything more. The Pacific spoke for him. For the Japanese defenders still alive inland, the effect was immediate. A captured radio man later told interrogators that the mountain exploded and then disappeared. Panic spread through the remaining garrisons, many abandoning their posts. Some thought they had been hit by a new kind of weapon, something beyond understanding. But it was nothing new. It was the old language of battleships, perfected. That strike became a legend within the fleet. Officers began referring to it as the 6-shell salvo, a moment when precision met power in perfect balance. It was written in after-action reports as a demonstration of maximum gunnery efficiency with minimum expenditure. But for those who were there, it was something more, a reminder of what battleships were built for. The Iowa stayed on station for hours afterward, scanning for any surviving resistance. None came. The beachhead advanced the next morning without a shot fired from those cliffs. For the Marines landing ashore, the giant craters were still smoking, the ground scorched and cracked like a volcano's skin. From that day, among carrier pilots and destroyer crews alike, one saying began to circulate. If it takes 6 shells, send Iowa. The strike at Ormoc Bay was not the end of her war, but it was her defining moment, the instant she proved that in the right hands, the old weapons could still rule a modern war. When the last echo of Iowa's guns faded across the sea, there was a strange stillness, the kind of silence that follows something too powerful to comprehend. The water, moments before boiling with concussion, lay calm again. Smoke drifted lazily along the horizon. In the distance, the cliffs of Ormoc Bay continued to crumble, sending black plumes of dust sliding into the surf. The radio operators aboard, Iowa logged the fire mission in a single line. 6 rounds expended. Target neutralized. That was all. 6 shells, 6 lines of trajectory, 1 entry in a daily report. But to those who had witnessed it, on both sides, the meaning went far beyond paperwork. For the Americans aboard Iowa, the feeling was complex. Pride, yes, but also unease. Many had seen combat for months, and they knew what that destruction meant on the ground. Gunners who had fired the rounds now stood on deck, staring into the haze. They couldn't see the target, but they imagined it. Men who had spent days calculating angles and elevations now found themselves thinking about what, or who, had been on the receiving end. There were no cheering crowds, no victory music, only the smell of cordite and salt below deck. The fire control team reset their systems, cleaning and cooling the barrels. Their work was done with machine-like precision. Yet, as one sailor later wrote in a letter home, "Every time we fire, it feels like the world holds its breath and then forgets to exhale." Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Japanese intelligence stations began intercepting the reports. The Army's radio network in Manila transmitted a fragmented message from Leyte. All coastal guns destroyed. Enemy battleship, likely Iowa class, engaged with extreme range and perfect accuracy. Area untenable. In Tokyo, naval analysts already knew what that meant. They had studied the Iowa long before she ever reached the Pacific. Her gunnery range, her fire control, her armor, all were well documented. But, until that moment, few believed she could deliver pinpoint strikes on coastal positions without direct sighting. That precision confirmed their worst fears. The Americans had mastered radar-directed gunnery to perfection. Within the Japanese Navy, the mood darkened further. The Yamato, once the pride of the empire, had been designed to dominate through brute force, its guns larger and heavier than anything afloat. Yet here was proof that size no longer decided victory. Iowa's success at Ormoc Bay wasn't just about power. It was about information, calculation, and control. Where Yamato had relied on courage and armor, Iowa relied on data and distance. It was a different kind of warfare, one Japan could no longer match. A Japanese officer later wrote in his diary, "We built our gods too heavy to move. The Americans built theirs to think." It was an observation as tragic as it was true. Back aboard Iowa, the strike team received word that carrier aircraft had confirmed total destruction of the target. The captain ordered, "Stand down from general quarters." The men exhaled, the tension leaving as quickly as it had come. Some cleaned their stations in silence. Others went topside, leaning over the rails to watch the fading smoke. A few lit cigarettes, shielding the flames from the wind. The ship's chaplain, walking the deck, paused by a gun turret. The steel was still warm to the touch. He muttered a short prayer, not for victory, but for those caught beneath it. By evening, the Pacific looked peaceful again. The sky turned a dull red as the sun dropped behind the horizon. The same red reflected in the oil-slicked sea. Far off, the faint rumble of carrier strikes still echoed, but aboard Iowa, the mission was over. The battleship steamed east to rejoin the fleet, her 6 empty gun barrels still trailing smoke. In the official combat summaries that reached Pearl Harbor days later, the operation earned only a brief mention, but among the fleet, the legend grew. Destroyer crews passing Iowa on convoy duty would look up and salute, half in respect, half in relief that she was on their side. In the ready rooms of carrier squadrons, pilots whispered stories about the ship that erased a mountain. Even among the enemy, the tale spread, though in Japan it took on a darker tone. Soldiers began calling the Iowa the ship of 6 shells, and so a single fire mission, lasting less than 2 minutes, became symbolic of an entire age of warfare passing into memory. It was the last time the world would witness the full, pure power of the battleship. Unchallenged, absolute, and terrifyingly precise. From that day forward, every admiral knew the next war would not be decided by guns, but by those who could command the sky. Yet, for one afternoon in 1944, 6 shells ruled the Pacific, and the world remembered the sound. The bombardment at the Ormoc Bay became one of those quiet legends that circulate through naval circles, not commemorated with medals or parades, but spoken of with respect in wardrooms and strategy papers. It proved something that admirals had long debated. Battleships still mattered. But at the same time, it proved something else, something far more decisive. Their era was ending. In the months following the strike, USS Iowa continued her relentless service across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Formosa, and later to Okinawa. Each mission blended the same 2 purposes: escorting the new rulers of the sea, the carriers, and hammering shore positions into dust. She was no longer the centerpiece of the fleet. She was the bodyguard and the executioner. The Navy's senior planners noted the irony. The Iowa class had been the culmination of 50 years of naval evolution, the final perfect expression of the gun battleship. And yet, barely a year after her commissioning, her power was already being overshadowed by the thunder of engines in the sky. The war that proved her worth also rendered her obsolete. Still, at the tactical level, her strike at Ormoc Bay changed the way the U.S. Navy approached fire support forever. Before that, bombardment missions were treated as preliminary, a prelude to the real fighting. After Iowa, they became strategic events in their own right. The accuracy achieved that day, 6 shells, 6 hits, set a new benchmark. It showed what could be done when radar, intelligence, and human precision worked as one. Other battleships tried to replicate it, but none achieved the same near-mathematical perfection. For the gunnery schools at Dahlgren and Pearl Harbor, it became a case study. Operation Ormoc Strike, a demonstration of complete fire discipline. Strategically, it carried a deeper message. By late 1944, Japan was losing not just ground, but psychological control of the Pacific. The enemy's greatest fear was no longer an invasion fleet. It was inevitability. The idea that no fortress, no ship, no island could hide. Iowa's 6-shell salvo embodied that truth. It was the sound of precision warfare replacing attrition, calculation replacing chaos. But for all her triumph, Iowa was also a symbol of a paradox the Navy could no longer ignore. Her guns could level fortresses, but they could not stop kamikazes. Her armor could deflect 16-inch shells, but not a 500-pound bomb dropped from the sky. Each victory reminded her commanders that no matter how perfect the battleship became, it was fighting a war that belonged to another age. As 1945 dawned, the great ships of the line, Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin, continued to hammer Okinawa and Honshu, paving the way for the end of Japan's empire. Yet they did so under skies darkened by the contrails of hundreds of American aircraft. The carriers they once protected now defined strategy. Battleships provided thunder, but it was the pilots who delivered the lightning. When news reached Iowa's crew in August 1945 that Japan had surrendered, they celebrated like everyone else, but with a quiet understanding. Their ship had survived unscathed, undefeated. Yet, they all sensed that their war had been the last of its kind. After the war, Iowa was placed in reserve, then recommissioned, then laid up again, like a giant kept asleep between eras. She would serve again in Korea and beyond, her guns still capable of reaching across horizons. But the world she was built for, a world of battleship duels and armor duels, was gone forever. Still, among those who remembered her 6 shells at Ormoc Bay, there was no sadness, just respect, because that day she had proved what a battleship could do when everything worked exactly as intended. When training, courage, and technology met at the perfect point of impact. The echo of that moment carried far beyond 1944. It lived on in doctrine, in memory, and in every naval officer who ever stood before a plotting board and imagined the sea as a weapon. War leaves behind records, charts, statistics, reports, but beneath those numbers are memories that never made it into official history. The story of Iowa's 6 shells lived on not only in naval logs, but in the hearts of the men who fired them, and the few who lived through them. For the gunnery crew, the memory of that day became something both proud and haunting. Chief Petty Officer Harold Sims, who had worked inside Turret 2, once said years later, "When those guns fired, it was like the ship was alive, breathing through fire." He remembered the deck trembling, the acrid smell of burned powder, and the silence afterward. "We didn't cheer," he recalled. "You don't cheer when you see what 6 shells can do." Decades later, when Iowa was decommissioned and turned into a museum, veterans would stand under those same guns, tracing the cold steel with their hands. Some smiled, others said nothing at all. The memory of that strike was something they carried quietly, not as glory, but as duty fulfilled. The human cost on the other side of the ocean was less often spoken of, yet just as real. Survivor accounts from Ormoc Bay, gathered after the war, describe chaos beyond comprehension. Japanese engineer corps and artillery teams had been working in the bunkers when Iowa's shells landed. One officer, Lieutenant Masao Tanaka, later wrote from a POW camp, "First came the wind. It pushed us flat. Then the earth lifted. I thought I had died already. When I opened my eyes, there was no sky, only dust." He never saw the ship that had fired those shells, but he remembered the sound, a slow, rolling thunder that he said did not end. To him, the strike was not just an attack, but a realization that Japan could no longer fight the kind of war it had begun. This duality, pride and sorrow, precision and devastation, became the unspoken legacy of Iowa's guns. For the Americans, those 6 shells represented discipline, mastery, and industrial might. For the Japanese, they symbolized futility, the sound of a war slipping beyond recovery. In naval academies, the event was studied for its technical perfection, range-finding accuracy, radar coordination, communication synchronization. But veterans who lived it remembered something else entirely. The feeling of power mixed with weight. One sailor described it as the burden of being the final word, because that's what Iowa was that day, the final word in a conversation that began in Pearl Harbor and ended with silence at Ormoc Bay. After the war, the guns of the Iowa-class ships fell silent for decades, then thundered again in Korea, and even in the 1980s. Yet none of those later bombardments carried the same mythic weight. The world had changed. Wars were fought by missiles and aircraft, not battleships. And so the 6 shells of 1944 became something more than a military event. They became a story, a symbol of the moment when man's greatest machine reached its absolute peak and then passed into history. For the men who served aboard her, it was enough to know that they had done their duty perfectly. They didn't call themselves heroes. They didn't speak of victory. They spoke of precision, of teamwork, and of trust. They remembered the sound that started it all, the deep, shaking roar that made the ocean itself pause. And they remembered the silence that followed, as if the sea was absorbing what had just happened. Years later, standing at memorial ceremonies, former sailors would sometimes be asked what they felt when those 6 shells were fired. Most would smile faintly, look out at the horizon, and answer the same way. It was just our job, but it was the loudest job on earth. History often measures power by scale, by how much noise, how much destruction, how much force a nation can project. But sometimes history turns on moments of precision. 6 shells, 6 perfect arcs. One moment when human hands, steel, and calculation reached absolute harmony. The USS Iowa was more than a battleship. She was the last breath of an idea. That man could build something so strong, so exact, that it could shape the world through sheer presence. In the age of machines, she represented craftsmanship. In the age of air power, she was defiance made of iron. When her guns fired at Ormoc Bay, it was not only the destruction of an enemy position, it was the punctuation mark at the end of the battleship's story. The thunder that once defined naval warfare was giving way to the silent hum of engines and the distant whine of jets. The old giants would fade, their decks turned into museums, their names remembered not for the wars they started, but for how they ended them. Yet the legacy of Iowa endures. It lives in every modern precision strike, in every command center where data and calculation decide the fate of distant targets. The principles born in her plotting rooms, coordination, timing, exactness, are the foundation of every missile and guided system that came after. The difference is only distance. The men of Iowa looked through rangefinders. Today's warriors look through satellites, but the intent, to strike with certainty, to end chaos through precision, remains the same. In the quiet of her museum decks today, the great guns still point toward the horizon. Tourists walk beneath them, unaware that once 6 shells from those barrels changed the course of a battle. And, symbolically, an era. No planes, no bombs, just 6 shells. And with them, the last great roar of the battleship age rolled across the Pacific and faded into history.